أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله الذي فرض التعليم على هذه الأمة اللهم صل وسلم وبارك وكرم على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن تبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم القيامة. نوينا التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والأفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله تعالى وسنة الرسول وابتغاء مرضاته سبحانه وتعالى. اللهم إنا نسألك فهم النبيين وحفظ المرسلين وإلهام الملائكة المقربين برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. أما بعد، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We say Alhamdulillah and we thank and we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all His favors and bounties that He has bestowed upon us. And we send salutations upon the beloved of Allah, beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to shower His blessings and His mercy upon His family and His companions and all those that follow Him until the day of Qiyamah. We say Alhamdulillah and we thank and we praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for all of His favors. And from amongst those favors that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed you and I to enter these 10 days and 10 nights of Dhul Hijjah. Nights and days in which you find many blessings. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed you and I to enter these days. So we should take advantage of these days, especially on the day of Arafah. And our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he advised that all those who will be slaughtering, they should not shave and they should not cut their nails until after they slaughter. And this was from the advice that our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave us. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who take full advantage of these days that are left. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who reap the fruits of these days, inshallah. We continue speaking about the Prophets alayhimus salam. And there were 3 questions that we got. The first one being, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew His soul into Nabi Adam, does that not mean that Sayyidina Adam would have the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And the person that asked the question said, logically speaking. And the second question would be that why did Sayyidina Adam eat from the tree if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade him to eat from it? And the third question was tabarruk and tawassul, right? So first we're gonna read about Sayyidina Idris, and then we'll do the questions, right? Because Sayyidina Idris is short. It's a short one, right? There's not much that is mentioned about Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam. So Sayyidina Idris was the prophet after, not Nabi Adam, after Sheeth alayhi salam, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, وَاذْكُرْ فِي الْكِتَابِ إِدْرِيسَ إِنَّهُ كَانَ صِدِّيقًا نَبِيًّا وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that remember or make mention in the book, meaning the Quran, of Idris. إِنَّهُ كَانَ صِدِّيقًا نَبِيًّا, that he was a truthful prophet, Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam. وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, and we raised him to a lofty place, we raised him to a high place, right? And we'll speak about that ayah as we go further on. He says, so Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, first when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spoke about him, one of the first things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala attributed to him alayhi salam was that he was somebody that was truthful, he was somebody that was trustworthy alayhi salam. And his name was Khanuh, right? We mentioned the nasab of Sayyidina Adam, so we mentioned all of them, and we said Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam. And it's mentioned that he is from those in the top of the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Alama dhakar ghayru wahid min ulama'i nasab. It's not all of them say, but many of the scholars of nasab, of lineage, they say that he was from the lineage of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. وكان أول بنى آدم أعطى النبوة بعد آدم وشيث عليه السلام. So he was the first one that was given nubuwah after Sayyidina Adam and Sayyidina Sheeth, right? Those names that we mentioned in the lineage, right? He was the first one, Sayyidina Idris was the first one to be a Nabi. He was the first one to be a prophet, alayhi salam. And it's mentioned that Sayyidina Idris was the first person to draw or to write. You know what khat is? right? Is to write or to draw. That Sayyidina Idris was the first person to draw. He was the first person to write ever. And it's mentioned in the hadith that many of the scholars say that Sayyidina Idris is the one who the Prophet ﷺ was talking about in the hadith. When the hadith of Sayyidina Muawiyah bin al-Hakam, when he asked the Prophet ﷺ about, he saw a drawing. Ramal is, what's the word for Ramal now? It's like dust, like sand, right? Like dirt. And he asked the Prophet ﷺ about this. Whose is this? And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, إِنَّهُ كَانَ النَّبِيُّ يُخَطُّ بِهِ فَمَنْ وَافَقْ خَطَّهُ فَذَاكَ. He said, ﷺ, that there used to be a prophet that used to draw with us, right? With this ramal, used to draw with this dust. And if you find any drawing with this from that prophet. So some of the scholars would mention that the prophet that our beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is speaking about in the story is Sayyidina Idris. Is Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam. And it's also mentioned, like we said about the ayah, وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we raised him to a lofty place and we gave him a high status. And it's mentioned that Sayyidina Idris, he was lifted to the heavens, right? To the fourth heaven. And he stayed there. And he passed away there. And the mention is وَرَفَعْنَاهُ مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا فَقَالَ كَعْبٌ, that Ka'b says, أَمَّا إِدْرِيسَ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ أَوْحَى إِلَيْهِ, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent wahi to Sayyidina Idris. إِنِّي أَرْفَعُ لَكَ كُلَّ يَوْمٍ مِثْلَ جَمِيعِ عَمَلْ بَنِي آدَمَ لَعَلَّهُ مِنْ أَهْلِ زَمَانِ فَحَبَّ يَزْدَادُ عَمْلًا, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I will raise your status every day according to the amount of all of mankind, all of the children of Sayyidina Adam. And the narrator says that in hopes that it was meaning all the people of all the children of Sayyidina Adam in his time, right? And so Sayyidina Idris, because he got this wahi, he loved to increase and he loved doing good and increase in doing good actions and anything good. فَأَتَاهُ خَلِيلَهُ مِنَ الْمَلَائِكَةِ, and one day a friend came for him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent somebody, like a friend, down to him, right, from the angels. فقال إن الله أوحى إلي كذا وكذا فكلم ملك الموت حتى ازداد عملا. So that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave me wahi for this and for that. And so Malik al-Maut also became part of this, right? And then he started, Sayyidina Idris, he started doing good and he started doing good. And one day, when he got onto the wings of the Malaik, of the angel, and flew him up to the heavens, right, to the fourth heaven. And so Malik al-Maut was there. And firstly, when he got there, so Malik al-Maut, he said, فَكَلَّمْ مَلِكَ الْمَوْتِ فِي الَّذِي كَلَّمَهُ فِي إِدْرِيسَ فَقَالَ وَأَيْنَ إِدْرِيسَ. And so he asked, where's Idris? He asked the angel, where's Idris? Idris fi السَّمَاءِ الرَّابِعَةِ. So they said that Idris is in the fourth heavens, right? But before that he said, هُوَ ذَا عَلَى ظَهْرِي. He said that they were on the fourth heaven, the angel and Malik al-Maut. So he didn't know that was Sayyidina Idris. So he said, where is Idris? And so the angel said that that's Idris on my back, right, on my wing that came up with me. فقال الملك الموت. So Malik al-Maut said, he says, Ya al-Ajab. He was surprised, he was amazed, right? بعثت وقيل لإقضي روح إدريس في السماء الرابعة. And then it was said to Malik al-Maut to take the ruh of Sayyidina Idris in the fourth heaven. فجعلت أقول كيف أقبض روحه في السماء الرابعة وهو في الأرض. So he said, how can I take his soul in the fourth heaven but he was on the earth, because his body was on the earth. فقبض روحه هناك. And so they took his soul there where he was. Right? So some of the scholars mention that Sayyidina Idris he also passed away in the heavens, right? But the difference is, because some would say that a similarity between Sayyidina Isa and Sayyidina Idris, right? Sayyidina Isa is in the heavens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said about Sayyidina Isa that we did not crucify him, right? What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say? Who knows the ayah? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that we raised him, right? We did not kill him. And so Sayyidina Isa is in the heavens. But Sayyidina Idris, he was lifted to the heavens, and then his soul was taken there, right? In the fourth heaven. And then they also mention that وَرَفَعْنَا, so this was one of the meanings of وَرَفَعْنَا مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا. Another meaning would be that وَرَفَعْنَا مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا رَفَعُوا فِي السَّمَاءِ السَّادِسَ فَمَاتَ بِهَا. Some scholars say that he was raised to the sixth heaven and he passed away there. وَكَذَا قَالَ الضَّحَاكُ وَالْحَدِيثُ الْمُتَّفِقَ عَلَيْهِ. And many scholars mention this and it's agreed upon hadith, but the hadith in which says that he passed away in the fourth heaven is more sahih, right? And Hasan al-Basri, he says, وَرَفَعْنَا مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا, speaking about this ayah, that وَرَفَعْنَا مَكَانًا عَلِيًّا is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raised him to Jannah. And there's not many things that are mentioned, or that we found about Sayyidina Idris, right? But one of the main things that you can take note of is that he was the first person, they mentioned he was the first person to draw, right? Or the first person to write Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam. And that was Sayyidina Idris alayhi salam, right? Like we said, there's not a lot mentioned, but when we go to some prophets, that would be more known. Like when we go to the next one is Sayyidina Nuh alayhi salam, right? Sayyidina Nuh is a long story. Like Sayyidina Adam was a long, Sayyidina Nuh is not that long, but it's a long story, right? What he went through with these people and everything that happened with these people. So some of them are short, and some of them are long stories. Like you'd see in the Quran, some stories are mentioned full, like the story of Sayyidina Yusuf, a long story. Story of Sayyidina Nuh is a long story, right? So this was just a short one. Some of the things mentioned. Like we said, we're going to be reading from this book. So we mentioned what's in the book, and we take from the important things that's in the book, right? And we use this book because this book is called Qassul Anbiya. There should be an English copy. This book mentions the sanad of the hadith, right? And most of the things that are mentioned in the book is ayat of the Quran, right? So, like we said, it was short, Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. Then we said we had 3 questions, right? Like we said last week that if you have questions, you can send it to put that tape, or if you watching on the live, you can type it through, and then they will send it to me, and the next week I'll answer the questions, right? So there was 3 questions. The one question was asked last week in the class, but there was no time to answer. And then there was 2 questions that we got in the week. The first one is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew his soul into Nabi Adam, does that not mean that Sayyidina Adam had the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And then the person that asked the question, he emphasized it logically speaking, right? Logically speaking. Firstly, the first thing, back to the qaida that we mentioned in almost every class, كل ما خطر في بالك فالله خلاف ذلك. Anything that you can think of or you can comprehend, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond that, right? And then the second thing, أن الله تعالى لا يحتاج مخصص يخصص. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need something to be inside. محل يحل. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need to live inside something. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not confined by anything, right? So logically speaking, the soul, right? If you say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala blew his soul into the body of Sayyidina Adam, right? That would mean if he blew from his soul, right? He said, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. That's وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. That I blew into him from my soul. So if you're looking at this literally, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that I blew into him from my soul. In saying that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a soul. But we know this is inconceivable because a soul is limited and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not limited. So, firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a soul. So when we understand this, we go to why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say وَنَفَخْتُ فِي مِنْ رُوحِي? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say وَخَلَقْتُ بِيَدَيْ? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say that to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِنَّكَ بِأَعْيُنِنَا? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that you are in our eyes, we are watching you. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that I created Sayyidina Adam with my hands. So because there is no literal meaning, you cannot say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a hand. You cannot say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has eyes. You cannot say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a soul, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond all of these things. Because all of these things are confining, right? All of these things have a limit. So, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond limitations, right? You cannot limit the one who is limitless, or you cannot give attributes of those who are limited to the one who is limitless subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not have a soul. So what is meant by min ruhi? You know, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَخَلَقْتَهُ بِيَدَيَّ, right? It does not mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used his hands, right? A yad can mean qudra, it can mean your power, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created Sayyidina Adam through his qudra subhanahu wa ta'ala, through his irada subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, إِنَّكَ بِأَعْيُنِنَا, he didn't say that you are in our eyes, we are seeing you. What was meant is that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was always being watched over by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and protected by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So yeah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, when we read the story of Sayyidina Adam, right? We mentioned that there were certain special things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Sayyidina Adam to show the malaika his merit, to show the malaika his honor, right? And one of these things was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, in a way of exaggeration, or way of balagha, right? That وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, that to show the honor of Sayyidina Adam, he said that blew from my soul into him, right? To show that he was an honorable person, to show that he is somebody that should be honored, right? But we don't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a ruh. We don't say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has hands, like the mujassama. They say that, and Jumhur ulama, majority of the scholars, they mention that the mujassama are not Muslims. Those that say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has body parts, that attribute body parts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like they will say, Ar-Rahmanu al-Arsh istawa, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is literally sitting on his arsh. He's sitting on his throne. And some of them would say, they give away, they say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sitting on his throne like this, and his leg is on the one, what's that called? The one arm pedestal, right? The one armrest. Say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sitting on the arsh and his one leg is on the armrest, and he's sitting and he's leaning to the back. وَنَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ. Once when somebody came and asked the scholar this, he wanted to test the Shaykh, he said, Ar-Rahman al-Arsh istawa, and somebody said, Kayf istawa? How is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala standing? How is he mustawa on the arsh? And so he said that your question that you're asking, right? He said first that the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sitting, right, is ma'loom, it's known. And the kayf is majhul, right? It's not shown to us. And the question that you're asking, there's no point to that question. Why? Because if it was an important question, then Sayyidina Abu Bakr would have asked about it, Sayyidina Umar would have asked about it, Sayyidina Uthman, Sayyidina Ali, they would have asked about it, right? There are some questions that we don't need to go into. There's some questions that don't benefit us. Like we said when we spoke about the tree, right? People want to argue that the tree is this, the tree is that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that was a tree and we leave it there, right? It's something that won't benefit you in your deen. Another example is the earth round or is the earth flat? When you come Qiyamah, Allah is not going to ask you is the earth round or is the earth flat. There's no benefit, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said Ar-Rahman al-Arsh istawa, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is on the arsh, istawa, right? We don't know how, we don't know where, we just Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said it, and we believe, right? So, you should be understanding the answer to the question by now, right? We said, we understood that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not limited to a soul. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, to emphasize the honor and the merit that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave Sayyidina Adam. And we can, because we cannot apply body parts to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we have taqdeer, right? We have interpretation. So like when you speak about the hands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? When they said Yadullahi maghlula, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim, also when they said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that was in the bayah, Yadullahi fawqa aydihim. It doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand means that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a part of that, right? But when you speak about and say Yadullahi maghlula, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands it was shackled, was tied up. Yet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, Bal yadahu mabsutatani, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hands are spread out. Right? Doesn't mean that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has hands that are long and spread out. Bal yadahu mabsutatani. What's next? Yunfiku kayfa yasha. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives and He gives and He gives, and it doesn't remove anything from Him. Right? That's why say yu'ti wa la yubali. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives and He does not care. Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives and gives and gives. Right? So we don't say بَلْ يَدَوْ مَبْسُوطَتَانِ. It doesn't emphasize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's long stretchy hands. It emphasizes the generosity of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? So we understand that. So we come to the conclusion that just because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, that I blew into him from my soul, this was said to emphasize his honor and his merit. It does not mean that because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي, that Sayyidina Adam has the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Because لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Right? There's nothing like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the first question. And everybody understood the answer to the first question. The second question, why did Sayyidina Adam eat from the tree after he was forbidden? Right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانِ. That shaitan came. He whispered in the ears. Right? And we don't want to go into depth. Some would say that no, because Sayyidina Adam was predestined, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted to put mankind onto the earth, so it was predestined for him to eat from the tree. But we stick to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said in the Quran, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانِ. Right? That shaitan whispered to them. And he promised them things. And he said that I'm giving you advice, take my advice. And he promised them power. He promised them, he said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's nothing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is keeping you away from you being immortal. Shaitan told him this. And he kept whispering and he kept whispering until they started to believe him and they started to listen to him. Right? And he said, وَقَاسَمَ لَهُمَا أَنِّي لَكُمْ نَاصِحٌ أَمِينٌ. That I promise, he said, that I promise to you all that I am a truthful advisor. I am a trustworthy advisor. Take what I am saying to you. And so they ate from the tree. And then after they ate from the tree, their private parts became apparent to each other. Right? Because the private parts weren't apparent to each other before. And they started taking leaves from Jannah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَيَخْصِفَانِ عَلَيْهِمَا مِنْ وَرَقِ الْجَنَّةِ. They started taking leaves from the ground and they started tying them around the private parts. Right? And they were deceived by shaitan. Some of the scholars mentioned that the first to eat from the tree wasn't Sayyidina Adam, it was Sayyidina Hawa. And then Sayyidina Adam followed Sayyidina Hawa. Right? So, why did Sayyidina Adam eat from the tree? Even though Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forbade him, we say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned, and He said, فَوَسْوَسَ لَهُمَا الشَّيْطَانِ. That shaitan whispered in his ears. Right? Shaitan whispered. And shaitan is there to deceive. Right? Shaitan is there to deceive. That's why He says, when they ate from the tree, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَبَدَتْ لَهُمَا الْغُرُورِ. Right? That as soon as they ate from the tree, they were deceived, right? As soon as they ate from the tree, they fell into wrong, right? So if someone was to ask why did Sayyidina Adam eat from the tree? Because Shaitan came and Shaitan whispered, and Shaitan kept whispering and whispering and kept giving them promises and promises and promises, right? He said that if you eat from the tree, you'll be immortal. You eat from the tree, you'll have wealth, right? And they started to listen and they ate from the tree. Was the person that asked the question? Yeah, I don't know if that was the right answer. Not if it's the right answer, if that answer is fine with him, or do we need to go more into depth? I think that answer should be fine, right? And then the third question, the third question is a question that people misunderstand, or they ask a lot about, or they make their own assumptions about, right? Many different people on this question. What's the question? Tabarruk and Tawassul, right? Tabarruk and Tawassul. And each of these are two different things. Tabarruk is taking blessings, right? And there are different types of tabarruk. Tawassul is asking through a means, right? And each of these has explanation. And both of these are confirmed in the Quran and the Sunnah, right? And we'll explain it to you so that you understand what is tabarruk and what is tawassul, right? So firstly, what's the definition of tawassul? Tawassul, firstly, it's one of the ways of showing your humility and your humbleness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? Because if you think that you are on that level where you can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala directly without the means, then you're not humble, right? So the first thing is that it's one of the ways, one of the paths of showing your humility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Secondly, وَأَحَدَ أَبْوَابِ دُعَاءِ وَالتَّوَجُّهِ إِلَيْهِ سُبْحَانَهُ وَتَعَالَى. Secondly, it's one of the doors of asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? You have different doors. We're not saying that you can't ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahumma, oh Allah give me this, oh Allah give me that, right? You can, but he's saying if you do this through a means that's showing your humility to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? If you go to a king and you want to ask him for something, when you walk in, can you immediately speak to the king? No, there's going to be somebody there that you have to speak to first, or somebody that you have to ask through that person to go to the king. وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثْلِ الْأَعْلَى, right? And the other one, the third one, فَالْوَسِيلَةُ هِيَ كُلُّ مَا جَعَلَهُ اللَّهُ سَبَبًا لِلتَّقَرُّبِ إِلَيْهِ وَبَابًا لِفَضْلِ الْحَوَائِجِ. So what is a wasila? A wasila is a means, right? A wasila is anything, any reason, or any means that can bring you closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or any means that is a reason for you becoming closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. And we know after Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, whatever comes next is either an order or a standing to stay away from something, or it's a prohibition, right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu taqullah wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, oh you believe. It's an order, it's an amr. That oh you believe. Be conscious in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila. You must look at the wording. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, wabtaghu. Ibtigha, you have some people who just translate as to want something. But if you say arada, yuridu is to want. But you say ibtigha, right? Ibtighan is a deeper yearning. You don't just want it, you yearn for it, right? So wabtaghu ilayhi al-wasila. Don't just look, or don't just say you want to ask for a means. It says look for that means and go and find that means, right, out of yearning to get closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة. So in the Quran, right, like we say, it's confirmed in the Quran and in the Sunnah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وابتغوا إليه الوسيلة. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He also says in the Quran, أولئك الذين يدعون يبتغون إلى ربهم وسيلة أيهم أقرب. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about those who call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanting that wasila, wanting that means. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أيهم أقرب, which of them is closer? And Sayyidina Ibn Abbas, he says that the ayah is generally speaking about Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. But remember, we said that al-ibra bi umum al-lafz la bi khusus al-sabab in tafsir. Right? The lesson we take is from the wording that is here, not from the specific meaning or the specific story behind it. So this ayah was for Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam. Right? وَالنُّجُومِ يَبْتَغُونَ يُطَالِبُونَ إِلَى رَبِّهِمْ وَسِيلًا. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you that those that call, right? Those that call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, يَبْتَغُونَ إِلَيْهِ الْوَسِيلَةَ يَبْتَغُونَ إِلَى رَبِّهِمْ وَسِيلًا, that seek, and they ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through a means. They ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through a means, أَيُّمْ أَقْرَبُ, who is closer, right? Firstly, you look, if you want to use a means, look which of those means is closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ibn Abbas, he says, أَيُّمْ أَقْرَبْ مَعْنَاهُ يَنْظُرُونَ أَيُّمْ أَقْرَبِ إِلَى اللَّهِ تَعَالَى فَيَتَوَسَّلُونَ بِهِ. Right? In the story of Sayyidina Isa alayhi salam, when it was the Malaika, the Shams, the sun, the moon, and the stars, right? As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَيُّمْ أَقْرَبْ. If you want to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through one of those things, right? First look which one is closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? And that one that is closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you ask through that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts your dua. For example, the people on Hajj, right? When you go to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and then you say, "Oh Allah, I ask you," for example, "Oh Allah, I ask you through the blessings of your beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to find me a wife," for example. Or you ask for anything, you ask for guidance, but you say, "Through the blessings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I ask you, Allah." One of the conditions of tawassul is that you're not asking the person, right? You're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but through the means of those that are close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that's what Allah says, أَيُّمْ أَقْرَبُ, which one are closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That one that is closer, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through them. And remember, we're not saying our own things here, right? These are things that are mentioned by scholars of tafsir, by Sahaba, right? And this what's mentioned here is what Ibn Abbas said. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also says, فَاسْتَغَاثَهُ الَّذِي مِنْ شِيعَتِهِ عَلَى الَّذِي مِنْ عَدُوِّهِ. That istighatha is seeking help, right? Istighatha is seeking help. فَاسْتَغَاثَهُ الَّذِي مِنْ شِيعَتِهِ عَلَى الَّذِي مِنْ عَدُوِّهِ. They sought help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? An example, you seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but through a means. Right? Through someone that's close, you ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, "Oh Allah, through the blessings of your beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, let there be rain." You have dry crops, you say to that blessing, let there be rain. Right? Wasila, like we said, it's a means of asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And another ayah, right? A famous ayah about seeking through the means. And I think we mentioned this before. Where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَقَالَ لَهُمْ نَبِيُّهُمْ إِنَّ آيَةَ مُلْكِهِ أَن يَأْتِيَكُمُ التَّابُوتَ فِيهِ سَكِينَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ وَبَقِيَّةٌ مِّمَّا تَرَكَ آلُ مُوسَى وَآلُ هَارُونَ تَحْمِلُهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةً لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told the Prophet of that time, right, that the sign of his mulk, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give them a box. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will send down a box. فِيهِ سَكِينَةٌ مِّن رَبِّكُمْ. In this box you find tranquility from your Lord. وَبَقِيَّةٌ مِمَّا تَرَكَ آلُ مُوسَى وَآلُ هَارُونَ. And leftovers that Sayyidina Musa and the family of Sayyidina Musa and the family of Sayyidina Harun left behind. تَحْمِلُهُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ. And on top of that, you will see the angels bring this box down for you. The angels will carry this box for you. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةً لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. This is a sign for you. And not just for, like we said, الْإِبْرَةُ بِعُمُومِ اللَّفْظِ لَا بِخُصُوصِ السَّبَبِ. Right? Not by the general story behind it, but by the wording. Right? It's a qaida, a rule in tafsir. إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَآيَةً لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. This is a sign for those people and the people after them and the people after them until the day of Qiyamah. If you are truly a believer, then you will believe that there was a box that the Malaika brought down, that in it was tranquility from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and in it there was leftovers of Sayyidina Harun and Sayyidina Musa. Right? And Ibn Kathir, he mentions that from what was in there was the staff of Sayyidina Musa, the staff of Sayyidina Harun, and so on. And some of their thawbs, right? So every time they went to go fight in a war or they fought in a battle, they had this box in front of them. And through this box, through this means, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them victory. This can also be used as an example for tabarruk, from taking blessings. Because through the blessings, we should explain afterwards, through the blessings of what was in that box, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave them victory. Because you can go read the story, right? In the tafsir books. There's many English translations of tafsir nowadays. After they got that box, and after they had the box in front of them, they never lost the battle through the blessings of what was in that box. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala aided them, right, through the means of what was in that box. And this doesn't mean that we have to ask them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need, right? Firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not need you to ask. Secondly, the means is so that you can humble yourself. Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give, He knows what you want. He can give it to you at any time. Right? But every reason has not a reasoning. But everything that comes down, right, you have to work for it. Like your money that you get, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. So you want 10k. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows you want 10k. It can now fall from the sky, you can walk outside, you find 10k laying there. But no, you have to work, you get your money, and you get what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wrote for you. Right? So, why? To humble you. Because if you knew that you could do nothing, that you were just going to get what you want, then you wouldn't be humble. Right? You would think that oh, I'm the guy. Right? I don't need to do anything. I can just say, I can just think what I want and Allah can get you. This isn't Jannah. Right? This world's a test. So, just like you have to work to get something, right? If you go work and you have the boss, right? And then there's always a few people that the boss likes. And if you want to make sure that the boss knows something, and you want to make sure that the message gets to him, you ask those people, right? وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثْلِ الْأَعْلَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond this. These are minor examples, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beyond this on a macro level. Right? They always give an example. They will say, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثْلِ الْأَعْلَى. And for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the greatest example. And so those were ayahs from the Quran. Right? Ayahs from the Quran. And then from the hadith is the famous hadith that we all know. I think we've mentioned it a few times also, of the blind man that came to the Prophet ﷺ. And he said, okay, in this narration, there's different narrations, right? But we're going to read the one that's mentioned here. In this narration, he mentions there was a man that was wronged. And he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, Udu Allah li ayyu'afiyani. That ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make me better. Ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to cure me. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, In shi'ta sabarta wa wa khairullah. The Prophet ﷺ, he told him that if you wanted to, you could be patient and it's better for you. Meaning if you're patient, you'll get a greater reward. But this man, he didn't still want the reward. He wanted to feel better. So, قال فدعوه. So he just said, he ignored what the Prophet said, that's better for you. He said, Oh Rasulullah, I just want to be better. So ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for me. And in another narration, the person said, لَيْسَ لِي قَائِدْ وَقَدْ شَقَّ عَلَيَّ. That the person said that there is nobody to help me, nobody to guide me, right? Nobody to help me in the house, and this could be more difficult upon me. And so after the Prophet ﷺ heard this, the Prophet ﷺ فَأَمْرَهُ أَن يَتَوَضَّأَ فَيُحْسِنْ وُضُوءَهُ وَيَدْعُ بِهَذَا الدُّعَاء. The Prophet ﷺ told him to take wudu. And he said, فَيُحْسِنْ wudu. Take the best wudu that you can. Right? And then he made 2 rak'ats and he made this dua. What's the dua that he made? Allahumma inni as'aluka wa tawajjahu ilayka binabiyyika Muhammadin sallallahu alayhi wa sallam nabiyyir rahma ya Muhammad inni tawajjahtu bika ila rabbi fi qada'i hajati lituqdali Allahumma shaffi'u fiyya. Right? Like we said, we gave Quran straight from the Quran, right? Straight from the Sunnah. The Prophet ﷺ told him to say that, Oh Allah, I ask you and I direct myself to you through, meaning he's using the Prophet ﷺ as a means. He said, through your Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, the Prophet of mercy, O Muhammad. And then he says, right? He first said through. So he confirmed that he's asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Then he says, Ya Muhammad, O Muhammad, inni tawajjahtu bika. Then he says, O Muhammad, I direct myself bika, with you, or through you, ila Rabbi, to my Lord. Taking a means, he's using the means. And the Prophet ﷺ taught him to use this means. He says that, Oh Allah, I ask you through your beloved Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Then he said, Oh Muhammad, I direct myself through you to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this need that I have, so that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can give me this need. فَشَفِّعُ فِيهَا. So cure me. Right? And then Bayhaqi mentions in his narration, فَقَامَ وَقَدْ أَبْصَرَ. Right? That by the time the man stood up, he could see. Right? Like we mentioned in the one narration where he says that he was blind. Right? In that narration, like we mentioned, the one that narrates the hadith, he said, after he made this dua, through the means, by the time he stood up from his place, he could see again. His sight was back. Because he used the means. He asked through somebody that was close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he got what he was asking for. Quicker than somebody that will directly ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Through the means. And this is an even more clear one. This is a sunnah, a dua that the Prophet ﷺ taught us to say whenever we leave our house and we go to the masjid. A dua, right? That the Prophet ﷺ said, say this whenever you leave your house and you go to the masjid. A hadith narrated by Abi Sa'id al-Khudri anhu, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, that the Prophet ﷺ says, من خرج من بيته إلى الصلاة, whoever leaves from his house to go make salah, فقال, so say, Allahumma inni as'aluka bihaqi sa'ilina alayk. He's not asking to the Prophet ﷺ. He says, Oh Allah, I ask you through the rights bihaqi sa'ilina alayk, through those who walk towards you, through those who make you their goal. وَأَسْأَلُكَ بِحَقِّ مَمْشَايَ هَذَا إِلَيْكَ. in another narration he said, Allahumma yas'aluka bihaqqi sa'ilina alayk wa bihaqqi raghibina ilayk. And all those who yearn for you, right? And those who have a raghba, to get closer to you, have a yearning to get closer to you, I ask you through them also, right? And then وَأَسْأَلُكَ بِحَقِّ not even somebody that's alive. He says, oh Allah, I ask you through بِحَقِّ مَمْشَايَ هَذَا, like through this walking that I'm doing, I ask you Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فإني لم أخرج أشرا ولا بطرا ولا ريان ولا سمة بل خرجت اتقاء سخطك وابتغاء مرضاتك. The rest of the dua is what is asking from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? But the shahid, the main thing that we should take note of here is he asked بحق السائلين إليك وبحق الراغبين إليك. And in the third one wasn't even somewhere else alive. He asked through something. He said بحق ممشاي هذا إليك, not his feet, through this walking that I'm doing. Oh Allah, accept my dua. It's a means, right? If I say that this masjid is the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I say, oh Allah, through the blessings of the walls of this masjid, I ask you to bring me closer to you. Through the blessings of the walls of this masjid, I ask you to bless me and fill my life with happiness, right? I'm asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the blessings of what is known as the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the blessings of a place in which if we speak about all the Muslims, say hundreds of Muslims, not specific masjid, a place in which hundreds of Muslims make salah and hundreds of Muslims go into sujood, right? That place, and these walls surround that place. And I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the blessings that are found in those walls to accept my dua. Wasila, right? Tawassul, that is confirmed in the Quran and in the Sunnah, right? So tawassul is understood. Is there questions on that? Thought so.
The first time I heard about tawassul,
They said it's shirk. The first time they said it's shirk. No.
I think the first time I heard about tawassul was, I think I was probably a teenager. I was sitting in the class of Imam Rahman.
Oh, okay.
And I remember he said there are three categories. She can rectify me when my question. There are three categories, specific categories of means. One category still remains with me that I remember. And that's a category where he said that you can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala by your own good deeds. And I think Shaykh has mentioned a couple of examples.
Yeah.
I've done a good deed to this person sitting next to me, and I can ask Allah through that sincere act of mine, and I can ask the question.
You can ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through his pious slaves. You can ask, like I said, the blessings of this wall. I can touch my car and I say, my car I drove, say for example, use this example. There's a tabligh jama, right? They get a van, and this van went right around South Africa calling people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now I go and I touch this van and I say, oh Allah, I ask you through the blessings of this van for this and for this and for this. Then somebody come, no shirk, bidah, this. I'm asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through a way that the Prophet ﷺ taught me to do. Right? The Prophet ﷺ taught you to do this. And if somebody asks you, and they tell you this is shirk, and they tell you this is bidah, and they tell you this, and they tell you that, and you mention this hadith to them, which is a sahih, there's no dislike to this hadith, there's nothing bad, it's not mawdu to this hadith. And they say they still don't believe you, and then you leave him. Because then he just want to complain. He don't want to be guided. Right? Our teacher, Habib Umar, he would say, and you would find videos about this. You will find this video. He said about tabarruk and tawassul. In one video he mentions this story. In another one, he mentions, speaking about tabarruk blessings, which we explain now, the shirt of Sayyidina Yusuf. Right? When Sayyidina Yusuf took his shirt and gave it to his brothers, and they said, this put over my father's face because his father was losing his eyesight. So when they brought it back and they put the sweater over Sayyidina Yusuf's father's face, right? فَارْتَدَّ بَصِيرًا, his eyesight came back perfectly, right? Through the blessings of the sweat of Sayyidina Yusuf. And then our teacher, Sayyid Habib Umar, he would say that if after we mention a hadith, right, of the Prophet ﷺ that is sahih, and you still say this is shirk, then you can say this shirk, I put the shirk on top of my head because the Prophet ﷺ taught this to us. And if you're saying that the Prophet ﷺ taught you shirk, and then you're saying the most beloved of Allah taught you shirk. If you call a normal person a mushrik and a kafir and you are wrong, then you the mushrik, right? Now you're saying that after you tell this person the hadith and they still say it's shirk, does that not indirectly mean that you're saying that the Prophet ﷺ did shirk? Because you're telling him that the Prophet told me to say this. So it doesn't make sense. But some people, they don't want to learn. Some people are arrogant. Some people, they think what they know is the only thing, even if you give them hadith. That's why if you mention, if people want to argue, you say, I don't want to argue. You can say something, I'll answer you. If you still want to argue after that, I'm walk away. Right? Finish. There's no need to argue. Your argument won't benefit you if you know the right answer and you can see that person came to argue, he didn't come to benefit. Right? La ilaha illallah. Baraka. Right? Yeah. Baraka. Baraka, straightforward, is blessings. Right? Blessings, a simple example is that through the tabut that we mentioned, the box that had the fi sakinatu min rabbikum, the tranquility of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wa bakiyatu mimma taraka alu Musa wa alu Harun tahmilul malaika. Right? Firstly, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that in this box was tranquility from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In this box was leftovers from Sayyidina Musa and Sayyidina Harun. And on top of that, the angels carried this box. Right? And through the blessings of this box, through the blessings of what was in this box, right? The staff of Sayyidina Musa was the blessed object, right? The thobes, from the thobes that they wore, was blessed, right? It's blessed. It was in that box. They mentioned that some of the scrolls of sheath, or some of the scrolls were in that box. It's blessed. Through the blessings of what was in that box, they never lost the battle. Right? Blessings, tabarruk. He's taking the blessings of something. Right? Like we explained in the tawassul, right? If it's something that's close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you can take the blessings. Hajjul Aswad. Right? People go, then they touch Hajjul Aswad, they kiss Hajjul Aswad, but if they go to the Prophet ﷺ, some people, it's fine. Some people say, no, you can't kiss. You can't wipe your hand over the Prophet ﷺ. But Hajjul Aswad is fine. It's the same thing. You're taking blessings, right? And you're taking blessings in the masjid. If I want to say, for example, somebody made tahajjud here. So it's the 10 days of Dhul Hijjah now, right? Every night, the whole night, there was somebody making tahajjud there, whole night. And I come and I sit there. And I say through the blessings of this place, because that person was making whole night tahajjud for 10 nights, right? The whole 10 nights of Dhul Hijjah. All the blessings and the mercy that descended upon that, because when you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He descends His mercy, right? The famous hadith, if you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the angels come and they go back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the angels say that they were remembering you and they were asking and they were seeking your refuge. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what were they asking? They were asking for Jannah. And so it goes on, and what were they seeking the refuge from? From the hellfire. Right? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, bear witness, O my angel, that I have forgiven them. فَإِنَّهُمْ قَوْمٌ لَا يَشْقَى بِهِمْ جَلِيسُهُم, because there are people who will not be misguided through those who they surround themselves with. Right? So even that place where the mercy descends, to the point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says to someone that remembers him, قُومُوا مَغْفُورٌ لَكُمْ لَقَدْ بُدِّلْ سَيِّئَاتِكُمْ حَسَنَاتٍ, that stand up from this place in which you remember Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Understand that the class counts as remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows the caller to call from the heavens after any kind of dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, قُومُوا مَغْفُورٌ لَكُمْ لَقَدْ بُدِّلْ سَيِّئَاتِكُمْ حَسَنَاتٍ, that stand up from this gathering in which you are remembering me. I have changed all your sins into good deeds. Right? So all the blessings that descend on that place where he was. So I sit there and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for this, and that's the blessings of that place. Right? I'm not asking that place. Same with the was, I'm not asking the wall. I'm not asking my walking. In the dua the Prophet ﷺ said, I'm not asking my walking. Right? Bihaq Imam Shaya. I'm asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala through the blessings of where I'm walking to and the walking I'm doing. Right? So through the blessings of that place, I'm not asking, oh Salamat, give me this, give me that. I'm saying, oh Allah, through the blessing that was found there, give me this. Right? Oh Allah, through that blessings, give me this. Accept this from me. Right? And then there are different types of tabarruk. You have tabarruk through the Quran. Through the Quran. Right? Taking blessings through the Quran. Sayyidina Aisha mentions in a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ كان ينفث على نفسه في المرض الذي مات فيه بالمعوذات فلما ثقل كنت أنفث عليه. So it's something that some of us still do, that the Prophet ﷺ used to read the mu'awwidhat. The mu'awwidhat is the three calls, right? Then he blows it over his hands and he wipes it over him, right? That's something that we see people still do it here in Cape Town, right? But they don't understand why they're doing that. The Prophet ﷺ used to do that, right? Through the blessings of the eyes of the Quran, you recite Ayatul Kursi, blow it over your hands, right? Some of our teachers mentioned that if sometimes when people are sick, then they will write Ayatul Kursi or Suratul Fatiha on a paper and put it in water, right? And then you drink that water. Here in Cape Town, they call it Pachavata. Huh? I don't know what that is. I heard, I heard some people say Pachavata also. Sometimes you go to somebody that's pious, then you ask them, then they recite over the water, or they make dua over the water. Right? Tabarruk. Then you have Tabarruk biqabrs to the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? To the grave of the sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's mentioned that the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam إذا خلى المسجد دسوا رمان المنبر التي تله القبر. Some of the Sahaba, after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam passed away, or when they were alone in the masjid, they used to go onto the minbar where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to sit and take the blessings of that. And then there are many types of tabarruk. There's one through sweat, the known story of the lady that every time that came, when the Prophet ﷺ was sleeping, right, the female Sahaba, she used to take the pillow and squeeze the sweat out, right? And then when the Prophet ﷺ finally caught, they said, what you doing? He said, every day I wash my children with this, through the blessings of this. Once when the Prophet ﷺ did cupping, and he told one of the Sahaba to go throw this away somewhere where nobody will find it. The companion went around the corner and drank the blood. Understand that in the Shafi'i madhab, blood is najasa, right? But not the blood of the Prophet ﷺ. So the man came back and the Prophet ﷺ asked him, but the Prophet ﷺ knew what he did. But he asked him, what did you do with the blood? He said, oh Prophet of Allah, I put it somewhere where nobody will find it. And why he did this was because he heard that the Prophet ﷺ said that anything that touches me, right, will not go to the hellfire. So he said, now with the blood of the Prophet ﷺ in his system, how can he go to the hellfire? Took the blessings of the blood of the Prophet ﷺ. And then you get blessings through clothes also. And there are many types, right? There's just one we want to mention, that's through the Salihin, through the pious slaves of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We're going to give an example of two major scholars. We all know Imam Nawawi, right? Imam Nawawi. And then you have Imam Subki, right? Imam Subki, rahmatullah alayh, one day he visited Imam Nawawi. Or not Imam Nawawi, after he passed away, he visited the place where Imam Nawawi used to sit at Darul Hadith. So he visited Darul Hadith and he asked, where's the place that Imam Nawawi used to sit? And so they showed him where is it. And so he sang this poetry and he said, في دار الحديث لطيف معنا أصلي في جوانبها وآوي. He said that in Darul Hadith, which was the place, right? He made 2 raka'ats on the sides. He said, so he waited till nobody was looking, because لعلي أن أمس بحضر وجهي مكانا مسه قدم النواوي. He said that in hopes, right? He was looking where Nawawi used to sit, and so he made salah on that place in hopes that my face goes on the place where Nawawi used to sit, right? Because that's where he used to sit and he used to teach his classes and where the blessings used to descend. So he wanted to make sujood in that place. Firstly, to the blessings of that place, and because أقرب ما يكون العبد إلى ربي وهو ساجد, the closest you are to your Lord is when you are in prostration, and you combine the two of that, and you're asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to accept your du'as quick, right? Through the blessings, and you're in the closest place that you can be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is blessings, right? Tabarruk. So you have tawassul and tabarruk. Whoever says it's shirk doesn't understand. Whoever says it's a bid'ah, they don't understand what the bid'ah is, and we explained already the understanding of a bid'ah, right? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us those that understand. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide those that misunderstand. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make all those who are not Muslim, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to guide them to Islam. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us of those who take the full benefit of these few days left of the 10 days of the Hijjah. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.